I always believed time was something I had. Not in abundance. Just enough. Enough to fix things later. Enough to become braver eventually. Enough to live fully once the right moment arrived. I never said this out loud, but I organized my entire life around that assumption. Time felt patient. Cooperative. Like something that would wait until I was ready to meet it properly. That belief didn't shatter all at once. It eroded. For most of my life, nothing was technically wrong. I wasn't miserable. I wasn't desperate. I functioned well enough that no one ever worried about me, including myself. I kept promises. I showed up. I handled responsibilities. From the outside, my life looked like progress. Inside, it felt like rehearsal. I was always preparing for a version of myself I assumed I would eventually become. The version who would take risks. Speak honestly. Choose differently. I treated the present like a draft, something temporary that didn't require full commitment. I thought that was wisdom. I see now it was avoidance. The first warning sign was subtle. I stopped feeling urgency. Not panic, something worse. A dull patience that made everything feel postponable. Conversations could wait. Decisions could wait. Happiness could wait. I told myself that rushing was immature, that restraint was proof of depth. But restraint without direction doesn't lead anywhere. It just slows the loss. Years passed that way. Quietly. Efficiently. I became very good at explaining why now wasn't the right time. I had reasons that sounded responsible, even admirable. Stability. Timing. Other people's needs. Practicality. Those reasons stacked up until they formed a wall I didn't know how to climb. What no one tells you is that missed opportunities rarely announce themselves as such. They arrive disguised as sensible delays. As small compromises you barely notice agreeing to. As moments you assume you'll revisit once you're more prepared, more confident, more something. Prepared for what? I never asked. I remember a night when the thought first crossed my mind clearly, what if this is already it, not a phase? Not a waiting room. Just, my life. The idea felt inappropriate, almost offensive. As if accepting that would mean admitting failure. I pushed it away immediately. People don't like to sit with questions that have no comforting answers. But once that thought appears, it leaves residue. I started noticing how often I lived in anticipation rather than presence. How frequently I narrated my future instead of inhabiting my present. I was always becoming, never being. Always planning, never arriving. The strangest part was that I wasn't unhappy. I was numb in a functional way. And that numbness protected me from panic, but it also dulled everything else. Joy felt muted. Desire felt theoretical. Even regret felt distant, like something reserved for much later. I told myself I was lucky. And maybe I was. But luck without engagement becomes invisible. The mental breakdown didn't come as a collapse. It came as a slow internal reckoning. A series of moments where I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had chosen something that scared me for the right reasons. Fear had become my compass, and I didn't even recognize it as fear anymore. It wore the mask of caution. Of maturity. Of patience. I wasn't running from life. I was waiting it out. Then something changed, not externally, but internally. A subtle shift in how time felt. Days began to blur together. Weeks passed faster than they used to. I caught myself thinking in terms of back then more often than soon. That frightened me. I realized I had been trading intensity for comfort, depth for predictability, truth for peace. And I had convinced myself that this trade was temporary, that I could always reverse it later. But later had started to feel theoretical. The dark secret I carried wasn't something dramatic. It was this quiet awareness that I had never fully stepped into my own life. That I had treated existence like a dress rehearsal long enough for the main performance to quietly expire. I had made safe choices. Logical ones. Reasonable ones. And somewhere along the way, those choices accumulated into a life that felt distant from the person I thought I was meant to be. I didn't know yet what I would do about it. I only knew that the illusion of infinite time was cracking, and once it cracks, you start hearing everything differently. Every delay sounds louder. Every someday feels thinner. Every excuse begins to echo. And for the first time, I wondered whether the greatest regret wouldn't be failure but never fully showing up at all. Once I lost the illusion that time was endless, everything began to feel exposed. Ordinary days no longer blended together comfortably. They stood in front of me, demanding something I didn't know how to give. Attention. Intention. Presence. I started noticing how often I postponed myself. Not tasks myself. My thoughts, my desires, my discomfort. I treated them like background noise, something to be dealt with once the important things were done. The problem was that the important things were never finished. There was always something else to handle, someone else to consider, another reasonable delay. I had become an expert at living on hold. The mental breakdown crept in quietly. It didn't announce itself with panic or despair. It showed up as irritation at small things. As impatience with conversations that went nowhere. As a low-grade exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. My mind felt crowded, but empty at the same time. I began asking myself questions I had avoided for years. What exactly was I waiting for? What future version of myself was supposed to take over and finally live the life I kept deferring, and why did I assume that version was guaranteed to arrive? The answers were uncomfortable. There was no clear milestone I was waiting to reach, no finish line after which life would officially begin. I had been postponing not because I lacked readiness, but because I feared consequence. Because choosing meant closing doors. And closing doors meant accepting that some versions of life would never happen. I preferred potential over reality. Potential felt limitless. Reality felt final. That realization hurt more than I expected. It forced me to confront how much of my identity was built on imagined futures rather than lived experience. I liked who I thought I could become more than who I actually was. And as long as I stayed in waiting mode, that fantasy remained intact. Time, however, doesn't respect fantasies. I started measuring my life differently. Not by achievements, but by moments of aliveness. And when I looked closely, there were fewer of them than I wanted to admit. Too many days passed without anything that felt real enough to remember. That scared me. I tried to make small changes. Wake up earlier. Be more present. Say yes to things I would normally avoid. But surface-level adjustments couldn't fix a deeper avoidance. I wasn't afraid of effort. I was afraid of committing to a direction and discovering it wasn't enough. There's a particular pain in realizing that you've been protecting yourself from disappointment by never fully investing. That by avoiding failure, you've also been avoiding success. I saw clearly then that my careful life wasn't neutral. It was actively costing me depth. The moral dilemma became sharper. Was it worse to disrupt a stable life in pursuit of something undefined, or to maintain stability while quietly suffocating people around me saw calm? I felt erosion. And erosion is hard to explain without sounding ungrateful. I noticed how often I told myself, it's not the right moment. That phrase became suspicious. When repeated often enough, it stops being wisdom and starts being fear in formal clothing. The more I paid attention, the more I saw how many of my choices were driven by the desire to minimize regret, and how that strategy had created a different, slower regret instead. One that didn't scream, but accumulated interest over time. I imagined myself years from now, looking back at this exact period. Would I see it as preparation, or as avoidance? Would I remember courage, or caution that imagined future version of me felt closer than the idealized one I had relied on for comfort. I could feel time accelerating. Not objectively, but subjectively. Weeks slipped by faster. Memories blurred. The days felt lighter, thinner, as if there was less substance in them. That sensation terrified me more than the idea of making a wrong choice. Because wrong choices still create stories. Inaction creates gaps. I reached a point where doing nothing felt like a decision and not a neutral one. Staying as I was meant accepting that my life would continue to feel postponed. That I would keep rehearsing instead of performing, that I would one day realize there was no audience left, not even myself. That's when escape entered my thoughts. Not dramatic escape. No disappearing act. Just the idea of stepping out of the rhythm I had accepted as normal. Of interrupting the pattern before it hardened permanently. I didn't know what that interruption would look like. I only knew that continuing as I was felt increasingly dishonest. Time was no longer something I owned. It was something I was spending whether I chose to or not. And the scariest part was this, I had spent so much time waiting to live that I wasn't sure I remembered how. The moment I finally accepted that time wasn't waiting for me, something inside me broke open. Not violently. Quietly. Like a lock giving way after years of pressure. I didn't suddenly become brave. I became honest, and that was far more destabilizing. I stopped asking myself what the safest choice was and started asking what the most truthful one might be. Those answers were rarely comfortable. They didn't come with certainty or reassurance. They came with risk. With the possibility of regret that would be loud instead of quiet. For a while, that terrified me. I realized how much of my life had been shaped by the desire to avoid pain rather than pursue meaning. I had mistaken absence of suffering for fulfillment. But a life designed solely to avoid discomfort eventually becomes a life without intensity, and without intensity, time dissolves. I began to see my past delays not as mistakes, but as signals I had ignored for too long. Each later had been a warning. Each postponed decision a quiet admission that something mattered more than I was willing to admit at the time. The hardest part was grieving the futures that would never exist. The paths I didn't take. The versions of myself I kept alive only in imagination. Letting go of those fantasies hurt more than letting go of real experiences, because they had never failed me. They had never disappointed me. They had remained perfect precisely because they were untouched. But perfection without reality is sterile. I didn't make a dramatic leap. I didn't burn my life down. I made a series of small, irreversible choices that aligned me more closely with myself. Conversations I had been avoiding. Decisions I had been deferring. Boundaries I had been too polite to draw. Each choice felt like stepping into cold water. Shocking at first. Then clarifying. I accepted that I would disappoint some people. That I would confuse others. That not everyone would understand why I had changed. And I learned something uncomfortable but necessary: being understood is not a requirement for living truthfully. Time didn't slow down once I started showing up. If anything, it became more precious. Days felt denser. Moments carried weight again. Even difficult experiences felt real in a way comfort never had. I stopped waiting for permission from circumstances, from people, from a future version of myself. I understood that permission was something I had been withholding, not something the world was denying me. Regret didn't disappear. It transformed. It became a teacher instead of a judge. A reminder of what happens when you trade presence for safety for too long. It sharpened my attention instead of paralyzing it. Now, when I look back at the years I spent waiting, I don't hate myself for them. I understand why I chose caution. I was protecting something fragile. What I didn't realize was that what needed protection wasn't my stability, it was my willingness to engage fully with life. If you're listening to this and telling yourself that you'll live differently later, I want to tell you that later doesn't exist. It does. But it's thinner than you think. And it's built entirely out of what you choose today. Time doesn't demand grand gestures. It responds to presence. To attention. To the courage to choose something real over something safe. I thought I had time. What I learned is that time isn't something you have. It's something you answer to. And the moment you stop postponing your life, even imperfect choices begin to feel like living.